he that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. So that's the eye for an eye punishment, tooth for a tooth, let's say, a judgment on murder. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither shall he flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death.
So taken from the altar, this is a beautiful law. I love it. You cannot come into my altar if you're a murderer and claim refuge.
Mm-hmm. Which would have been common.
Right.
That's right.
Elsewhere
Again,
in the ancient world, right?
Yeah, certainly in Greece
this is
too,
a total break with the world as it was. This is a revolutionary text.
No asylum for this.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, and there's also an attempt here to distinguish between different forms of what might easily be aggregated together as murder. So in 2112 you have the death, a death paid for by a death, but in 2113 there seems to be an insistence that if it was accidental,
like if you get into a bar fight or something, like emotion flares up, you kill someone, it's not the same.
Premeditation.
Yeah, it's not premeditated.
And the punishments therefore differ, and so that pertains to some degree to the discussion we had yesterday about intent, is that if the intent, I would say,
Right.
if the intent is to kill.
Yeah, but it's interesting. You may think, well, I mean, it gives an example. A man has an axe and the handle falls off and kills somebody. Clearly a total accident. And yet he does go to a city of refuge. To protect him from the family who wants to get vengeance.
Yes.
But it's not an ideal life to be in a city of refuge. You're away from the regular world, and you're there till the chief priest dies, by the way. And there is a belief apparently in the Torah, and we are free to disagree, that even pure negligence, nevertheless, the Torah takes homicide so seriously, and there are a dozen examples, and this is one of them. Even if you kill accidentally, you should have been more careful. I'm sorry. The way we treat people who are inebriated and then run over 5 people, and then they don't spend a day in prison because they were inebriated, or they spend 2 years in prison. This is not Torah way of looking at it.
But it still seems
you killed people because of your negligence. You shouldn't have drunk.
But it does still seem as if the punishments are calibrated to the degree of intent.
Yes. Oh, totally.
Right.
Do you think there's at least 2 ways of reading this? One is, I talked to a woman in Albania. I hope I was in Albania, where there are parts of the culture who fell into a cult of honor killing that's been going on for centuries. And so, to what degree, so the honor culture cult is, well, if you kill my brother, then my family has now a moral obligation to slay one of you in return, and generally the one of you in your family that's of highest value. And the problem with that, well, the advantage of that, I would say, is there's an element of justice and there's an element of the respite of revenge. But the disadvantage is, well, it never stops. It just gets completely out of hand. And that's happened in this section of Albania for hundreds of years. It actually happened among Catholics there, interestingly enough. But I'm wondering, too, if the sanctuary city isn't there also to protect the person
I said that.
Yeah,
yes.
oh, okay.
Yes,
so it's there as well to protect the person from the vengeance.
Killing,
yeah, okay. And then 21:15, and he that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. And that's an echo of what we described yesterday, I would say, of the necessity of honoring your mother and father. This is parceled out as a particularly serious crime. Right.
You're attacking the source of your own existence. You're kind of annihilating yourself when you're attacking your parents.
Well, and you're violating, according to our discussion yesterday, that principle of verticality, right? That if the honor,
hinge,
the hinge,
the vertical and the horizontal.
This is all of these, in some sense, are following from. They're ways of, let's call it, enforcing. They're the consequences of breaking the laws we looked at yesterday. So the commandments are not simply, it would be good if you did these things and so on. That's to leave them in a certain state of, I don't know, subjective attendance. Like,
And vagueness.
it's good. Yeah, vagueness. This is saying, no, these really are the rules that make the conditions of this community full stop. And therefore, there have to be consequences
Right.
to violating those.
Right.
And so these are detailed breakings down of, at least according to this law,
Right.
what the punishment for those things has
Yeah.
to do in order to honor the higher level
Right. Well, we
commandments.
said yesterday that the simpler commandments were no murder. Well, the thing about no, I've thought for a long time, thinking through the philosophy of punishment, especially in relationship to children, what does no mean? And no in the final analysis means if you do that, something you do not like will certainly happen to you. If that isn't the promise behind your words when you say no, there's no promise there at all. And so your point is, well, if it's a prohibition, there has to be a limit, and the limit has to be detailed and understandable to everyone as well, and also proportionate. And that's what's attempting to be established here, right?
May I ask a psychologist a rather simple-minded question? Why do you think the force of this, he that smiteth his father, I mean, the Freudian resonance of that is will strike the modern mind. Now, clearly, Cain and Abel, sibling rivalry, and we've had a lot of that in the UK of late, that makes sense. Why is there such a difference between the eruption of antagonism between brothers, which is pretty normal in my experience and probably others, and this shift between that and
well, we
the
took this
father?
apart yesterday in a slightly different context, and the idea was that to orient yourself properly morally, two things have to happen at the same time. You have to orient yourself properly with regards to that which is transcendent, so that might be the moral order that extends across time, that's universal. And you have to orient yourself in relationship to your community. And the commandments seem to be structured according to that differentiation model. Vertical orientation up Jacob's ladder, and horizontal in relationship to other people. Somebody commented that you see that echoed in the Sermon on the Mount when Christ says you have to love God and your fellow man. And so it's the honoring of the father and the mother that seem to be the place where those two things unite. I mean, one of the things that's disturbed me about our modern society is that people complain about the tyranny and brutality of the past in a manner that's entirely ungrateful. And you have this responsibility to honor tradition. And I think that the manner in which tradition manifests itself that's most local to you is in the form of your father and your mother. And so if you strike them, it's not only that you're striking another person, smiting another person, but that you're violating the principle of something like respect, honor for tradition itself. And then you're violating that vertical principle.
And there's an interesting aspect to this, I think, in what Goethe says, when he says that a child needs roots and wings, and that the parent gives the child stability so that the child can obviously leave and be free. And it seems to me that there's a very interesting relation to that thought and to our lack of a sense of tradition in contemporary culture, and the failure to recognize that re-inhabiting tradition, which we have to do, given our nature, is a creative act.
It's also a courageous act in some sense that you're called upon morally to honor the tradition. And that begs the question, well, why? And the question might be begged, for example, when people are called upon to feel guilty for the excesses of the British Empire, for any empire for that matter, is that we bear the mark of the brutality of history, and of that there can be little doubt. So what's your proper response and orientation to that? And the answer still seems to be something like, it's incumbent upon you to honor your tradition. And then I think you have to go about figuring out how you do that. I think what we were supposed to be doing in the universities was guiding people through that process, helping them separate the wheat from the chaff and saying something like, well, here's what we take from the past that's of tremendous value, part of the golden thread of conversation. So one good example of that might be, well, do we decry the establishment of the United States because slavery was still rampant when that state was established, or do we carefully note that at the time the American state was established, that a spirit that called for universal emancipation was making itself manifest, and that the spirit that oriented the America that's most proper, and say the American relationship to the UK, was actually that spirit that was calling for universal emancipation? We can say, well, there were proclivities that were pulling us back into the temptations of enslavement, but the fundamental spirit was one of emergent emancipation and universality of the principles of human dignity. And then if you're an educator, you help people sort that out and extract out what's valuable. And I think that's the same thing as honoring your father. I mean, one of the things I found so exciting about university was that I was able to find a group of meta peers. Right? I mean, new friends, and that was wonderful. You know, it was a renewal in that. But by delving into the great books of the past, I could acquaint myself with people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and far more ancient thinkers than that, and pull out what was so valuable about their contributions, while still saying, well, not everything that was applicable in the past is applicable in the present. And I think that is part of that, honoring your father and your mother in a metaphysical and philosophical sense. So,
a word about the death penalty. There are many such death penalties in the Torah, the first 5 books. And I won't take the time. I will only say that I am convinced that they were always put there as a deterrence, with the one exception of murder. And the reason I believe murder is the one exception where the death penalty was meant literally and not as a simply statement of how severe the sin is regarded in God's eyes, is that it is the only law in all 5 books of the Torah, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that you will take the life of a murderer. Secondly, it is one of the only laws God himself gives in Genesis. Genesis has almost no laws. One of them, in the very beginning of the creation of the world, is that if a human being takes the life of another, his life shall be taken by humans, because in God's image humans were created. So again, we have no example in Jewish history of a child being put to death because he hit his parent. But it is in there for, as again, I believe, God's wanting to communicate how severe that act is in God's eyes.
The command, you say, about murder is stronger or different in some way than the command about a child hitting a parent?
Yes. There's no, or any of the other, or there are many examples of adultery, or male homosexual relations. There are many examples where the death penalty is offered, but we have no record of somebody actually being put to death for it. It is there to say this is a serious sin. Why the homosexuality obviously is worthy of. I wrote a 22,000-word essay on that verse. It will come out in my Leviticus commentary, if I may offer that as a thought. But most important, again, it is the only law in all 5 books, and it is the only one that God himself gives, the only death penalty in creating the world.
Yeah. And I think what happens is, I understand, some people get completely turned off when they read the law, because all they see is all these people being
death
killed.
Penalties, that's right.
And then they stop thinking about what the laws are about and
that's
what it
why
is
I
they're
said
trying
it.
to set
Thank
up.
you. That is why I wanted it to be noted.
Yeah.
It is not meant to be enacted. It is meant. What was the Torah going to say? If you hit your parent, there's 100 shekel fine. I mean, think about it. How does God communicate how serious the parent should be taken? You go to jail for a week. I mean, they didn't have jails.
That's right. There's also a situation that they lived in a world where everything was so precarious that if someone fell out of the bounds, there was nothing to do with them. You can't have a mechanism for incarceration.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Right.
Right.
So 21:17. It's an extension of the same line of thought with regards to honoring tradition. And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. More variation.
All right, you will love this one, I promise.
If men strive...
Forgive me, I want to do one on the insult. Hebrew insult comes from the root kal, which means light, as in non-heavy. And the word to honor comes from the word kaved, which means heavy. To take your parent, so in other words, taking your parent lightly is the literal translation of curse, and taking your parent heavily is the literal translation of honor.
Oh, that's interesting, because heavy implies something that's deep and profound, right, and in the depths. And so the notion there is that if you take your parents lightly, that you don't build your foundation on the foundation of tradition. And then you'll be light, and then you'll blow away during a storm. So,
yeah, beautiful.
If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. Dennis, you discussed including this particular verse, so I'm going to turn that over to you.
Well, very quickly, this is uniquely, no, I don't know if uniquely, but it is a particularly difficult one, because it's an odd law. If two men are fighting and by accident, one of them strikes a woman who is pregnant and her children depart from her, then the following happens. It's not exactly an everyday situation. It must have been a specific moment and what the adjudication was. And there is no great clarity here, because it is not clear when it says in the Hebrew, and there be, what is the word that you use, mischief? What is the term?
And yet no mischief follow.
Right, okay, so the Hebrew means damage, generally speaking. Mischief, damage, there are many translations.
That means the woman is unharmed, I would say, right?
No, that we don't know. Is it her or is it the children?
Right, the children, like that she gives birth to the child, let's say.
Well, the children come out, right? So if they are not injured severely or even killed, then you pay what the judge says you pay. And the people who are pro-choice have one take, and people who are pro-life have another. But we have to be intellectually honest. We don't know which it refers to. Is it the woman or the children? That no further damage takes place, or further damage does take place, to be precise. That's all I really wanted to note. That there is not much to be read into this in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, except to say that if you believe the damage is to the children, then clearly that is a statement about the worth of the human fetus. If you say it's only to the parent, then it has no statement about the worth of the fetus, but we don't know whom it is talking about. That's all. That's really important, I think, to note. And by the way, it comes from someone who does believe that the human fetus has worth. We have to first tell the truth. We can't read Scripture in the light of how we want it to sound. That's I guess the more important point.
What's interesting is that many jurisdictions recognize the worth of the fetus when it comes to double homicides.
That's right.
But not when it comes to their own of the same jurisdiction's abortion laws. It's a strange paradox.
Yeah, which I've never understood. Yeah. Okay.
Well, it seems to be a reflection of the same underlying complexity that's tangled up in that verse.
But one thing is clear about the whole burden of this, the whole book of Exodus, is that the family and the process of reproduction and raising children is fundamental to the well-being of the community, and it's protected by huge barriers.
Yeah, and we'll return to that very shortly as we get into chapter 22. 21 continues. This is a very famous line. Everyone knows this.